Today, I am joined by Malcolm and Simone Collins. They are, I think, first and foremost, parents. They are passionate about education. They are pro-natalists, the authors of a very engaging series of books called The Pragmatist Guide. And they are famously the first people to create the so called Gattaca babies, the embryo selected special babies. Welcome.
Hello, we are so excited to be joining you today. I'm Malcolm Collins.
Yeah, we're so excited. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on. I mean, it is very interesting. I mean, in the preamble to this chat, I said, my audience is kind of I don't know heterogeneous on the subject. I mean, I have a lot of people who are interested in fertility technologies. A lot of people who, I think, for good reason, have doubts about not only what's possible but what's wise to the paths that are wise to go down. But I think one thing that unites probably most of my audience is a concern about fertility, about demographic decline, demographic catastrophe, about a lot of the things that you think you've thought a lot about, and you've been very practical about things. So I think that the first thing I want to start this conversation with is about the personalities that you two are, because you're a very interesting combination of talents and skills. And I just wonder, what is the background here? How did you find each other? Because you are kind of a a hydra. You have the same project. You're very much aligned. Most people, myself included, were just kind of like, fumbling in the dark, and maybe we gather some things. But you guys seem to have a very structured approach to everything. You're literally writing books about it.
Simone, you want to go over the story of how we met?
Yeah, sure. I'll do the rundown. So yeah, you're totally right. We're way too weird about the way we do everything. So the way it came down for us meeting was I turned 24 and had never really dated anyone before. I mean, people probably thought they were dating me, but I was too autistic to actually realize that. So, whoops.
But she never kissed anyone, never had sex. That's what she means. Like never went out there.
Completely clueless. So I decided that even though I was going to live alone forever, because that would be amazing, that I would first fall in love and have my heart broken so I could say I'd tried it and it was underwhelming. And, then people wouldn't look at me and be so, weird about it, like, oh, that poor girl has never known love. So I created a scoring system. I created a competitive dating round at my office where you get points for like first base, date that lasts longer than 5 hours or something, to motivate me to get out there, because dating is hard. So I was dating very heavily. I'd keyword stuffed my OkCupid profile at the time with like sort of know your meme references, because I knew exactly my target audience. I was posing in film grade stormtrooper armor in my photos. So I knew what I was in for. And Malcolm similarly was on what he would call a high throughput screening kind of campaign.
Marriage Quest. I was trying to do 5 dates a week at least for a period of about 2 years.
And so he told me basically that on our first date. He sat across from me at dinner and he said, well, I'm not really looking to date. I'm looking for a wife, and I expect to find her this fall at Stanford, where there's a large pool of pre-vetted candidates. So he made it both clear that he was looking for a wife, that he didn't think that I was that wife, because he was going to get one at Stanford, and that he was really honest. And it was the first honest date I ever went on, right? I mean, when you go on a date with someone, like typically like they probably want to have sex with you, or they have some other thing, but no one ever talks about that. You talk about like anything else but what people are actually there for, which was for me so frustrating, because I just wanted to know what people wanted. And I just thought that was great. And I also thought it was perfect, because that way I thought I could date him. We would break up. I forced him to set a breakup date with me, and then he would go find his wife and I would live alone forever. That particular plan completely fell apart. We are very happily married. We've been together for 11 years now. And we have 3 kids, going on hopefully 7. So like we're in it. And we love life together, but it was it was both very intentional, but the outcome was not what we had expected. And I think that's kind of the thing is we plan to the nines and do try to intentionally think through everything, but we also rapidly iterate and update when we get new information. And it doesn't matter if it's about like a life partner or a philosophy or scientific information. When we get new information, we adapt and we change our plans. We don't just stick to something because it's what we originally believed.
Yeah, I mean, very interestingly, this is a very kind of similar strategy to one that I use. It wasn't so well structured. It wasn't so well thought out. It wasn't so, I guess, detailed and meticulous in its execution. But that's pretty much what both me and my husband did. We were very kind of with the keyword stuffing that rings very true. Like I definitely did that with
Yes.
my OkCupid profile. That's where I met my husband. And I just kind of I keep encouraging people to see these websites as a tool because I feel like they've kind of taken on a cultural life of their own. I mean, these are databases of people. Many of them will be looking for similar things to you, but I think people over optimize for reach and for mass appeal, like women posting cleavage shots even though they want to get a husband. I mean, you
Yes.
will get more engagement, I guess, if that's what you're optimizing for, but that's a vanity metric. If you want to find the one, so don't park your boobs on the thing. That's not how you get it. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to convince people of this, but I think app dating is can be very useful. I mean, it's proven miraculous in my life, and I'm now heading for baby number two myself, and my marriage is great. It's app derived. It's generated by the terrible algorithms, but hey, it worked, and I think it can work for other people, but they have to have a pragmatic approach to how to use this stuff.
I mean, app dating has really changed recently, and I think we need to be transparent about this. We found each other back in the old days of OkCupid before the
True.
swipe dating revolution. And I saw a tweet recently that I really emphasized was where it said, being in a happy relationship these days feels a bit like having caught the last chopper out of Nam. Like I look
Yeah.
at the people who are dating today in this like Skinner box swipe based ecosystem, and I don't know if I would have been able to be as effective in the dating pool in this current market.
It depends. I think I I was, I met my husband about 6 years ago, and we were very much within the swiping system. I mean, we swiped on OkCupid. OkCupid had already transformed into a Tinder clone. It did have a more, I guess, generous space dedicated to the bio. It wasn't like 3 points, but yeah, it was kind of like that. And I'm sure things are much worse, and I do have the last chopper out of Nam feeling, but I think it's still possible. It's still people. Maybe I sound like a boomer now, but it's there's still people in there. I think no. So yeah, I mean, I do hope it still works. I hope I'm not giving people terrible advice, but yeah, I mean, I guess it worked for me, and my chopper was fine. So I guess get your own chopper.
Yeah, I think if you're intentional enough and you understand the adverse incentives and other corrupting factors at play in the current design of the system, and you play the system, then you can absolutely make it ad nom. I think the problem is that people are getting played by the system, and they're also like women are going on, they're serving up boob pics because it, generates attention. Then they end up pairing off with a lot of men who would sleep with them but would never date them. Then they get the impression that those are the men who would be willing to commit to them, and they aren't. They're lazy eights, and maybe these women are like a 6 or a 7. And so then they're not willing as a 6 or a 7 to date 6s or 7s who would be interested in marrying them. And then there's this sort of like broken dynamic where a lot of like, we'll say like 7s and below of men have trouble finding anyone who's willing to go on a date with them. And then women who are 7s and below have a lot of trouble finding any men who are, 8s, 9s, and 10s who they think would be interested in them to ultimately marry them. So a lot of people just end up alone.
Yeah, yeah, I think. Yeah, I'm just saying that this stuff should be common knowledge, but it is very counterintuitive, and a lot of people, at least in the case of women, hope dies last in a lot of these things, and I know a lot of women, essentially stuck in the so-called friends with benefits hell, just waiting on to be, wife number 5 for some strange guy who's, maybe like just slightly more attractive than they are. And then, they're just hoping that one day he'll just wake up and, propose because I don't know, she's really good in bed or something like that. I know it doesn't work like that, but like I said, hope dies last.
I mean, I think we also need to be honest that we are having a bit of a masculinity crisis in terms of what it means to be a man in our modern society. It was very interesting to me on some recent podcasts. One people were saying, "Oh, he looks so soy," and I'm sorry, I have to apologize to your listeners. This is not my house. I'm staying at a guest house right now. I did not choose this background. Speaking of looking soy, or that they look like a lesbian couple, and what it has made clear to me is that the male role models we have in our society today are often the iteration of masculinity that men are when they are teenage boys. When a man is in a long-term monogamous relationship and when a man starts to have kids, his testosterone level drops because his biology basically turns off suicide mode and is like, okay, now you're secure. Now you have kids. We want to keep you alive a long time. Turn off this high risk, high reward strategy. And this sort of kinder iteration of masculinity, when people look for it in our society, they see so few role models that embody it. The first thing that pops into their head is, oh, lesbians, that's kind masculinity. And it's a real, I mean, you see someone like Andrew Tate, right? Which I think represents sort of the teenage boy's ideal of what it would be like to be an adult man. Whereas because men sort of go through this second puberty, when I look at like his lifestyle, it looks about as fun as Blippi's lifestyle. I don't know anyone here who has kids, and Blippi's like this little kid who he's a grown man, but who like wears overalls and like dances around like a fire truck or something. And of course, to a little kid, it's like this guy is living in heaven. Oh my God, he gets to dance around fire trucks all day. But as an adult, like I see the pain behind his eyes, and I'm like, I know no adult actually wants to live this lifestyle. And if you are a dad looking at Andrew Tate's lifestyle, he is like the Blippi for teenage boys, where you're like, nobody is enjoying this.
Yeah, no, that's a very good comparison. I mean, it does seem like we've kind of stuck culturally on a certain archetype, which is in a way not differentiated at all. And I think maybe people like Andrew Tate are kind of a reaction to the fact that the baseline is very androgynous. We're all the same type of cog in the machine type of person who
Yeah.
the ideal producer consumer who has to go out and get the status points, get the money. And then I guess, in our spare time, we fetishize these cargo cults of masculinity, of feminine. Andrew Tate is essentially the mirror image of Kim Kardashian, which has all these like hypertrophied aspects of femininity. I mean, it's, they're golden calves of whatever is missing in our core culture. And it really, I feel like, what's missing here is just the pragmatism of what it would take to continue our culture, because this infinitely malleable producer consumer, he can't think above the timeline of his own life. I mean, production consumption happens within mostly youth, because even old age is very much questionable under the producer consumer model, because what are you going to consume? You can't really play the status games very much, so you've got about a like 30-40 year window where you can be a good participant in this culture. And I feel like it's really shortchanging not only older people but our entire future, the entire horizon of what's coming after us. It's almost making us blind to what's coming, and that's what I appreciate about you, because you're thinking about this very deeply.
Let's talk about the collapse of civilization.
Yes, please.
This is a very important topic. So this is something I really got. So I was a venture capitalist in South Korea, and I'm always having to predict the future of the economy there and everything like that. And if you look at their current fertility rate, which is 0.8, that means and it's dropping every year. So it might be like 0.7 next year, it looks like. That means for every 100 Koreans alive today, there's going to be between like 6.6 and 4.3 great grandchildren. So we're looking at a 95% population collapse in the next century. And I went and I brought this to the other partners at my firm. And I was like, there is no economy here in the future. Like, what are we talking about? Long-term Korean economy. There is no long-term Korean economy. Like, the way we structured our economic system doesn't work with this kind of collapse. And what they basically said is, oh yeah, we all know about this, but like we've just chosen collectively not to freak out about it. So just pretend like it's not the case. And when I came back to the US, we are today where Korea was in the 90s, but we're seeing all the same trends here. It's like a Black Mirror episode or like a Sliders or something. I got to travel back in time 20 years and I get to warn people about the things that I notice. One is there is no point at which people really start to panic. And by the time people start to panic, it's too late. So if you have a society where 80% of the population is over 50, they may still have 50 years of their life left, like half their life left, but they're not having any more kids. And so if you wait until that happens to sound the alarm, it's already game over. You've got to sound the alarm way before you notice this in population levels. And the other thing is that there is no natural floor. Actually, the UN, I think it's the UN or the World League, I don't remember, but one of the major organizations that tracked this, they used to believe that no country could fall below repopulation rate. So in all their data, it would just show everything plateauing when a country hit repopulation fertility rate. That means that they're having enough kids just to repopulate the number of adults. If you look at the world today, people are like, oh, this is a developed world problem. No. If you look at Latin America, as of 2 years ago by UN statistics, so like a lot of progressives, they're like, oh, we'll just import immigrants, right? In the US at least. And it's like, did you not know that like as of 2 years ago, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean collectively fell below repopulation rate? In fact, on average, a country falls below repopulation rate today when the average citizen is earning over $5,000 a year. So the only countries that are really massively above repopulation rate are desperately poor countries. And so the question is, well, how do we maintain, if it turns out that like prosperity, gender equality, education, and access to technology create cultures where that are just unstable intrinsically, like what does the future of our species look like? And that's what we're really focused on. And how do we prevent that? And that's why we started the Pro-Natalist Foundation and why we wrote the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, which was our latest book, because like a lot of people, they first hear this and their first thought is, oh, give people money. But like, it turns out the less money you have, the more kids you have. So that's like not the answer. And like when you have free childcare, like in Europe, the countries with free childcare actually have lower fertility rates. And cash handouts don't work either. Like Hungary spent like 5% of its GDP last year on this, and they got fertility rates up by like 1.6% when like they were falling by like 2% a year before that or something. So it turns out the only real solution is probably religion. And that's something we go into a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of like a lot of things on this podcast. I learn mostly from my own example, and I know my kind of conversion to pronatalism has been cultural, if maybe tangentially a little bit religious, but not purely so. So I mean, this seems to be, also knowing the examples of other people around me, I know people coming from families with their parents had 5 or 6 brothers and sisters are now have decided that they don't want children, which is very much a cultural thing as well. I mean, this is not like these were people who they frolicked and multiplied very well up until 5 minutes ago, and I know exactly the software these women and men have been downloading because I was kind of marinating in it myself until I realized that wait a minute, I'm just like staring off the edge of the abyss here. But yeah, I mean, and I think that's a very interesting lever to pull. I think what's a bit harder to do, I think, is the any sort of top down imposition of this stuff, which I think we're talking about mega trends here. I mean, how do you see that? Because I mean, you've written an entire book about this. This is the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, which sounds very ambitious. But yeah, how would this work? I mean, in practical terms.
I mean, we're rabidly against any sort of top-down imposition. It doesn't work, and it always leads to evil. When you're, as a government, trying to decide who should have kids, who should breed, who should not breed, that always leads to evil. I'd like to preserve some aspect of our pluralistic society, but any one couple that represents one culture and decides to join the pro-natalist movement, decides to try to craft a culture that they can pass to their kids and that their kids want to maintain, can sort of save that cultural unit. Because, if we have 8 kids and our kids have 8 kids and we do that for just 11 generations, that's more descendants than live on Earth today. this is the problem is the homogenization of the world today. So many unique cultures are dying out. So that's one problem. The other problem is the economic effects of this, because we have sort of structured our society like a pyramid scheme that requires constant growth. I mean, yes, you see this in Social Security, which is a problem, but you also see this in debt. You know, we as a society have been taking out debt at every level, which is fantastic if you're growing. You know, if you make an investment, you know, we used to be private equity people. If you'll make a $10 investment, right? And $2 of that is equity and $8 is debt, and that grows by just 20%. So it grew by $2. My equity investment has grown by 100%. I mean, 100%. But if it shrinks by just $1, my equity investment has dropped by 50%. If it shrinks by just $2, my entire equity investment is wiped out. And this is kind of what happened to Detroit, because their tax income started to go down and they were supporting a fire department pension and a police department pension from a time period, because these were functionally debts because these weren't pre-funded pensions, from a time when the city was much bigger. And then you get the same problem with the sewer systems and stuff like that. So you begin to have shutdowns of water supplies, and people hear falling populations, and the first thing they think is cheap real estate. But when everybody knows that real estate is always declining in value, what you don't get is cheap real estate. You get a Detroit situation. You get endless urban blight, because it is no longer relevant to invest in real estate. Invest in the upkeep of real estate.
But if we're talking about like the basics of either how to craft a culture / religion that survives, that is what we would call intergenerationally durable. That is to say, like, it is passed on from generation to generation and there are future generations, or to reinforce an existing religion to make it intergenerationally durable in the face of globalization and modern technology and prosperity, which is kind of the big sort of cliff for many existing religions, where they're just like not able to survive in this modern environment. There seem to be like two simple keys to it. And I mean, our book is very long and goes into a lot of detail, but there seem to be two basic components. And Malcolm, you might want to clarify this further. But if I were to break it down, it would be: one, find a reason why people would want to have kids. And that could be build a culture where everyone lives off the grid and literally you have to have kids because you need farm hands and like a retirement plan. Or it could be, you know, build a culture that really idolizes having kids and that celebrates and elevates parenthood and makes it look really cool. You know, there are different levers you can use to do this. And then the other element of an intergenerationally durable culture is it imparts fitness. And that's two types of fitness, obviously. Like, one form of fitness is people who practice it have surviving offspring, clearly. The other part of it, though, is ideally it imparts some kind of advantage, either within its own ecosystem or within a larger ecosystem. That could be, for example, many religions impart greater mental resiliency, better physical habits, you know, like literally better like day-to-day fitness, but also professional fitness. You know, think about Latter-day Saints, who are often sought after sales hires because they, you know, if you've been on a mission and you've been like pitching a kind of hard to pitch religion to people in another language, like, of course you could pitch SaaS, like that's easy. So those are the two elements. And so it's pretty simple: motivate people to have kids and give them a competitive advantage.
Yeah. So to follow up on something she was saying, where she's like, a lot of religions, I think people aren't familiar with the statistics here, which is religion is the single thing that protects people from fertility collapse the most, but it is still eroding in the face of our modern toxic culture. You look at something like Mormons, by current statistics, they've probably fallen below replacement rate, or they will within 5 years. You know, and I say when Mormons have fallen below replacement fertility rate, that's not, you know, the canary in the coal mine dying. That's when the miner's skin is bubbling off. You know, you are in deep when the Mormons fall below repopulation rate. But some cultures seem to be really resistant for prosperity-induced fertility collapse. And keep in mind, we're talking about prosperity-induced. We're not talking about the countries that are hand-to-mouth starvation. They still have really high fertility. But in the prosperity-induced ones, like one country that is just like off the charts good with fertility is Israel. And you actually see this around conservative Jewish cultures. They are one of the most resistant cultures to fertility collapse. A lot of people think Amish culture is resistant to fertility collapse, but it's really not. Anabaptist culture more generally. So it is a little more resistant to fertility collapse than other cultures, but the primary resilience comes from being sort of air gapped, a cybersecurity term, i.e. when they use cell phones, they also have fertility collapse, but when they don't use cell phones, they don't have fertility collapse, which I think shows where this is coming from in our society. If you view, this is something Simone was talking about, if you view religions and more traditional cultures as this aspect of humanity that evolved alongside us to sort of enhance our individual fitness, that's why they figured out all this stuff that progressives are just now realizing, like, oh yeah, you should have arbitrary self-denial rituals from like Ramadan to Lent to Feast of the Firstborn. Every ancient culture is like, yeah, you should like not just eat whatever you want all the time. You should have arbitrary fasting rituals and stuff like that. And just now you hear like, oh, I'm on my juice cleanse or I'm on my fast today. And like they figured this out after throwing it out for 50 years. It's like, what else did you guys throw out? But anyway, uh, this is like a traditional healthy cultural unit. But you have this thing that we call wokeism, but it's more than wokeism. It's like this virus that exists behind our world today, and evolved out of religion. We actually argue in our book it evolved out of Hicksite Quakerism. But it's not a full one. It can only survive by parasitizing on healthy cultures because it doesn't motivate a birth rate. And so it has to very aggressively get into things like the education system to convert people from these healthy cultures that are still motivating high birth rates to survive. And it's really scary because it is so effective at reaching our kids. As you say, you have friends, even at reaching you. You begin to normalize to what the virus says is normal. And this is where I get to something. You were talking about how some conservatives may disagree with us or whatever. I don't know, but I consider myself a conservative, right? And I think one thing that's great about the Conservative Party or conservatism in general is that we have a diversity of ideological perspectives that come from our traditional cultural backgrounds that we are trying to preserve. Whereas the progressive movement is just sort of this virus. If I go to a far progressive Unitarian Universalist versus a far progressive, I don't know, some other far progressive Muslim or a far progressive Jew, and you scratch beneath the surface, many of their beliefs about morality, about the nature of the world are just the same. If I go to a conservative Muslim versus a conservative Jew versus a conservative, evangelical, their actual views about how the world works are radically different. Yet they can work together to achieve a combined outcome, and that's one thing I really respect about the conservative movement.
Yes. I think it's also kind of a function of being out of power. I mean, power at the center consolidates, and it's very easy to align with it. Even there's a lot of people who maintain the trappings of whatever ethnic flavor they have, and they're like nominally Muslim or something. But it's pretty clear what exactly power demands of you now, just because it's in the water. I think a lot of people, like you said, if you scratch them, it's like the progressive Ten Commandments are just below the surface. It's because they're in everything. That's how I know exactly what software my maybe not anti-natalist but non-natalist friends are on, because this has been piped in hot through every medium for since we've had television. I mean, that's it's pretty clear what you're supposed to believe. And if you're kind of agreeable, and if you're interested in status games beyond your own little village, which is kind of one of the problems that has led to kind of fertility collapse here as well. Because people are, they're interested in what's going on in America. I mean, obviously, I'm included in this group of people. Yeah, that's going to lead to this, and it's going to lead to people essentially running the same moral and yeah, just having
Well,
the same orientation.
here's the great thing, though. I think from a lot of people's perspective, is this is leading to a genetic change. So the people who are sort of susceptible to this mimetic virus are essentially genociding themselves from the gene pool really aggressively. And if you look at the rate to which voting patterns, so like if you look in the US, the rate to which voting patterns correlate with genetics, which is like 30 to 50%, and you look at differential fertility rates, we should see a genetic shift, a state one standard deviation shift more conservative in voting patterns within the next century at like a genetic level. But there's other negative genetic shifts that are happening at the same time, which are also sort of worth noting. Which are really scary. Like we're also probably looking at a standard deviation shift down in IQ in the next 75 years. So I think a lot of these genetic shifts are just happening way faster than the public is aware of, as is fertility collapse.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of where your interventions come in. And I mean, Obviously, a lot of the genetic selection and um, any sort of intervention in genetics is seen as eugenics, as kind of this, far right, at least associated with the far right idea. But I think your perspective is that this can be much broader, and this could have much wider applications that are not necessarily just for your local skinhead association. But yeah, could you go into that a little bit, or maybe just kind of tell the story of the Gattaca babies and explain what exactly the Gattaca babies are, and kind of how far you've taken it, and maybe how far you'd like to see it go.
I'd like to see Simone take this, but one thing I wanted to note in regards to, like, when people hear pronatalism, they think white nationalist, they think skinhead, but unfortunately the data just doesn't align with that. If you look at the two cultures that are most resistant to prosperity-induced fertility collapse, it's conservative Christians and conservative Jews. And if you're looking at conservative Christians, this is a mostly white group. Like, white people actually are probably the population that should be least freaked out about this. If you're talking about the population that should be most freaked out about this, is probably East Asians. Because there doesn't seem to be many cultures within their ecosystems that are resilient to this. So and in addition to that, a lot of people associate this with like being against immigration or whatever. But if you look at the cultures in post-prosperity world that are most resistant to fertility collapse, you're looking like the United States, France, and Israel, all of which have some of the highest immigration rates. And you see within the non-immigrant groups higher fertility rates tied to the level of cultural diversity in an ecosystem. So, like, for example, French Caucasians have much higher birth rates than like British Caucasians. And if you look at the mono-ethnic cultural ecosystems, like Korea, they often have the lowest fertility rates. So just as it's not convenient for the progressives who are like, well, we need more money, give me money, and then I'll have kids, it's also not as convenient for the ultra conservatives. But Simone, I'd love you to talk to the genetic stuff here.
Yeah, and I'll start by saying this. This is not to say that we aren't complete freaks on the genetics and transhumanist side of the spectrum. I mean, Malcolm has turned to me on our morning strategy walks after dropping off our kids at daycare and been like, well, maybe our future generations, like our descendants, should like develop purple skin genetically, so everyone knows that they're of like our culture. There's like a unique identifier. We talk about all sorts of things. A lot of people are AI apocalypticists these days in like rationalist EA circles, and we're more like, well, how do we integrate with AI? We just have to keep up. We're going to have to augment humanity biologically as much as we can, just to be useful to AI in the future, because there's no stopping that train. Like, we, for one, welcome our robot overlords and we want to serve them well. So we need to get with the program. But I think the original reason why we decided to use polygenic risk score selection in selecting our next embryo was for the same reason why parents send their kids to SAT tutoring and why they bend over backwards to send them to good preschools or spend time trying to teach them to read. It's that we want our children to be iteratively better than we are. And polygenic risk score selection also enables you to do some really straightforward risk reduction, both before and after your child is born, that's really meaningful.
Can you explain it, Simone, what you're talking about?
Yeah. So, for example, my mother passed away way too young from ovarian cancer. Polygenic risk score selection allows you to look at the relative score of your different embryos of developing things like ovarian cancer, like Alzheimer's disease, like schizophrenia. So you are able to look at risk factors that you may be really worried about and reduce the odds that your child develops that disease. Maybe all of them have a terrible polygenic risk score around a certain disease. If they're just your kids, you and your partner's kids, that's, could possibly happen. But even then, just knowing your kid's polygenic risk score for certain things is really useful. Like, let's say that your polygenic risk score for developing schizophrenia for one or all of your kids is relatively high. That's really meaningful because you can tell them, listen, your friends might be out like smoking pot, cannabis might be everywhere, but you specifically really have to stay away from it until you're fully myelinated, until your brain has fully like developed, because your odds of developing schizophrenia when being exposed to cannabis are way higher than the average person. So there's a lot of like functional things, early screening, other things that knowing these things can really help kids do. So yeah, we did it. even though we're crazy about a lot of things, the reason why we first got into this is we just want to give our kids the best possible roll of the dice that we can, given current technology, which we understand is flawed. This is new, like Wild West territory, but it's also incredibly cool.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I wondered, would you have chosen IVF given absolutely no fertility constraints or anything? Did you fall into this because you had issues, or was this something you said, okay, from the beginning, we're going to go the IVF route, whatever, and we're going to, approach this in a very meticulous, pragmatic way? So, was there that constraint?
We would so this is this gets into our weird religion, our metaphysical belief. We would argue that the future police sort of we practice descendant worship. So sort of like Malcolm, you can explain it after this.
First, let's get to her question. Simone cannot have kids naturally. We did not have a choice to use IVF. We would have used we had to use IVF no matter what. We tried to get pregnant for like 5 or 6 years, and it was just clear it was not going to happen. It was all of the medical interventions you could have outside of IVF. Once we were doing IVF anyway, and we had the genetic data anyway, we were like, okay, let's do stuff with this. However, there's the other side here, which is, would we now, with what we know about genetics and stuff like that, still be engaging with it? Maybe not with technology as it is right now. Like, I'd like technology to be a little more advanced before I engage with all this voluntarily. But I do think that by the time my own kids are having kids, I would encourage them to engage with this sort of technology because it'll be much higher quality by then, and it might make sense to opt into it. Because it, as Simone said, we sort of have a theological mandate within our family towards intergenerational improvement. And this is, when we talk about crafting religion or whatever, the idea of, okay, well, 1,000,000 years from now, 10 million years from now, if our descendants are still around, this is where we get into crazy rationalist stuff. Are they going to be closer to the way we would conceive of a human today, or the way we might conceive of a God today? And if they are closer to the way we would conceive of a God, which we think they probably would be, will their relationship with time be commensurate with our relationship with time? And if it's not, who's to say that they aren't rewarding us for creating this prosperous future for humanity and punishing us when we do things that are selfish or indulgent? Or, this is why Simone's in a snow jacket right now, because we don't heat our house. We try to donate, 50% of our income every year to charity, just to try to live with this maximum amount of austerity in sort of service to this deity we have with our family. But it's a secularized version of our ancestral belief system, which is Calvinism, which believes in like predestination and everything like that. And I think that this is something that a lot of people should look at doing. Both Simone and I were raised in secular families, and what we realized as we've gotten older is that pure secularism doesn't work. Like, it just functionally doesn't motivate high birth rates. It leads to all sorts of mental issues. If you look at like religious versus secular people, like mental issues are off the boards. If I look at who's happy, conservatives are always, since Pew's been doing polls, far conservatives, far religious people are more happy. And so we basically said, okay, well, we weren't raised with a religion, but let's look to our ancestors. Let's look to rekindle something like that we can that can motivate the type of service that I think is necessary to live a mentally healthy life.
Yes, I think it is interesting because you kind of approach this from a secular. I mean, you declare your religion to be self created. Obviously, it's based on kind of a reasonable assumptions from your perspective on what the future might look like a few million years from now. But there are some kind of core assumptions there. And I've been kind of researching antinatalism in the last few months, and essentially they also make core assumptions, but they have negative polarity there. I mean, they're essentially negative utilitarians about everything, and their conclusions are very different. Obviously, they want to extinguish all of life. I mean, at the extremes, obviously, there's some people who just opt out of the idea of having children. And the philosophical background there is that life is suffering, and there's any sort of creation of life is increases a little bit of suffering. But I mean, what I'm saying there is that there is a certain leap of genuine faith in there, and the idea that life is worth living. And do you think that that's something that you seem like very cheerful, very like your baseline of cheer is quite high. Do you think there's something in the way you guys are that motivates you to apply the plus sign to life itself, and that kind of fuels your religious instincts about this?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. One thing that Simone was mentioning is well, so you mentioned so people have a happiness threshold, and this is something that's well studied. You win the lottery, you go back to a baseline level of happiness over time. This happiness threshold is heavily genetically influenced. And would we say that people with a higher happiness threshold should probably be having more kids? Yeah, but I mean, we'll soon be at a point where hopefully we can edit this and ensure that our kids have a high happiness sort of set point. But to your negative utilitarianist, sorry, you just mentioned this. I want to make sure your listeners know what you're talking about, because I actually think it's really important to understand the antinatalist and to understand progressivism more broadly. It's a broadly negative utilitarianist perspective, which means they don't believe that happiness really has value, but they believe that suffering, particularly emotional suffering, has really high negative value. And if you look at what the progressive movement right now is really optimizing around, it is to remove intra-moment, like if the conservative movement is about maintaining intergenerational cultural fidelity, the progressive movement is about removing intragenerational and intra-moment emotional pain at all costs, even if it causes long-term emotional pain. So you could see something like, why are we doing like all of these movements to not tell fat people that it's unhealthy to be fat, like the Hayes movement and stuff. Like, obviously this causes more pain in the long run, but the emotions of having to hear that causes emotional pain in the short run. Simone, you were going to say something to this?
Not to this exactly, but I think there's something really interesting to be said about genetically inherited tendencies, or genetic tendencies in general, and the optimal culture for you. So we're kind of descended from a pretty high energy Calvinist background, like both of us. And the culture that we have intentionally designed and adapted based on that is appropriate essentially for our like psychographic profiles. And what Malcolm, and let's be clear, I just want to make this super clear. Malcolm writes all of our books. I just make them readable. So what Malcolm argues,
my wife is a liar.
Yeah, he's
she
so
writes
sweet.
all the books.
He is the ultimate husband. Take responsibility for everything that goes wrong and give credit to someone else when things go right. That is Malcolm. But what he argues is that when you are going to reinforce or create your own culture or religion, you should not forget where you come from and what your ancestors did and believed in, because that is going to give you clues into the kind of religion and rhythms that will work best for you. And I think it's interesting to look at that interplay, because Malcolm also describes the close relationship that culture and biology have played throughout history. So essentially, the way he puts it is, when humans started living in cities, in like sort of bonkers, weird, non-normal foraging environments, beyond a small troop or tribe, to essentially be able to adapt to that weird environment quickly enough to deal with all the crazy technological explosion that took place after that. Culture was developed as sort of this like software add-on or operating system that enabled humans to adapt to modern society, to like post-agricultural society. But there isn't just culture and just biology. These things evolve together and reinforce each other. So you can't just separate the two of them. They do play together. Like Malcolm alluded to earlier, there is going to be genetic shift in voting tendencies and a lot of things based on which cultures are reproducing more. And I think that's a very underrated, under-discussed subject that is really interesting.
So this is, to play on what Simone's saying here, is we sort of argue that humans have this firmware, which is like our genetic proclivities, right? You look at a mouse and how it interacts with another mouse. Like that's just its genetic proclivities, right? Like it doesn't have a culture. But humans have this other thing, which is our culture / religion, which sits on top of that, like a co-evolving software. And through those evolutionary processes, it's able to figure stuff out centuries before science does. This is how, Judaism and Islam figured out hand washing centuries before modern science did. But you can even go different from that. Humans in our like ape-like distant ancestry, tribal ancestry, were probably evolved to be polygynous. If you look at cultures, 86% are polygynous, one man, many women. But if you look at the successful cultures in the world, most are monogamous. So they have enforced and you can see why. So if you look at monogamous cultures next to polygynous cultures have much lower rates of rape, much higher rates of trust in business transactions, much lower rates of murder. And this is directly correlated with the number. So you can afford some level of polygyny for the elite in a society always, which most societies have. But once you go below that, where it really gets toxic to have polygyny at like a high level, is where you have a large number of unmarried men. And you can look at it directly in polygynous cultures. The more unmarried men they have, the higher rates of all these social ills you're going to get. But the other point that Simone was making that I just think is it cannot be said enough is that these individual cultural traditions co-evolved with the people living within them. And to that extent, there is not one sort of like, even though we're secular, we don't think that other people could psychologically live under the secular sort of religious structure we have built for our family. There is not one that's correct for everyone. It's best to take inspiration from your grandparents and your great-grandparents and the way they lived before our parents' generation sort of screwed everything up.
Yes, I think this is, you put it in a very subtle and gentle way, but this is essentially the kind of the core, the most anathema thing to think in a liberal, globalized, democratic type of system that we all inhabit now. Yeah, I mean, the idea that people are not interchangeable, that certain cultures are specific to the populations that they've been generated out of.
But
Yeah, it's a
hold on, I
tough
want to go
sell.
here. What's the point of diversity if people aren't different? That's what I've never understood. Like
Not really about diversity.
it's not really about diversity, and that's the secret. They secretly want to erase diversity. That's the reason why they hate things like, the Haredi Jew problem in New York, because they actually have different cultural values. They want the people to dress a little different and not interfere with them and let them take their kids whenever they want, just pluck them to keep their population stable, and then pat them on the head. Oh, it's so cute. You're different from us. But they don't want real diversity. And that's what I love about the conservative movement is we understand the value of diversity is people are different. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, and it's much more robust. It's the only robust way of having any sort of large scale society. The idea is very kind of libertarian of kind of local experiments. Each culture is in a way an experiment of its own. Like you were saying that monogamous cultures tend to be more successful. I mean that these were experiments based on both biology and culture and the interplay between the two. But it's pretty clear. I mean, if you're not very progressive, you can kind of see who won. And I mean, it's something we don't really have the opportunity to do anymore. I mean, I've had Robin Hanson on recently, and we were talking about this exact thing that we are now in a global monoculture. There's no way out of it. It seems like the alignment of even local elites to, I mean, people call this like, the World Economic Forum, Davos, whatever. It's not that. There's a certain memeplex that everyone looks to, like, the alignment with global liberalism or democratic norms or whatever you want to call it. But alignment is almost instant, almost everywhere in the world. So we don't really get to have local experiments anymore. We don't really get to have even the development of local cultures. Like this is kind of what I'm rebelling against by doing this podcast as well. I mean, I've seen, things that I thought were dysfunctional while I was living in the West, and I was like, yeah, let's see what's going on back home. Same stuff, maybe a little bit, adapted and translated, but it's absolutely the same, and it's, delivered instantly. So I think this is very dangerous in itself, and I feel like people can't even assess how dangerous it is to put all of your eggs, all of the global eggs, in one deteriorating basket.
You are so right that today they've won. The virus has won. It is consumed. And this is how the virus is different in religions. The reason I call it a virus is because it eats religions from the inside. It doesn't need you to identify as a slave to the virus because it already eats your institution. Oh, you used to identify as like a progressive, ultra, whatever religion. Well, now you're the same as every other progressive iteration of that religion. Oh, you used to identify as a feminist. Well, now all the feminist movement has been eaten by this. Like it used to be something different. All these people used to be something different. But what's awesome is that it's also lost. It's lost entirely in the long run because it is completely sterilizing. Whatever it gave to people, it gave them along with this negative utilitarian mindset. And so I argue that this sort of dominating cultural force now, it looks powerful today, but it's a bit like somebody right after they got a severe dose of radiation. Like they may not realize they're functionally dead yet, but all of their DNA has been scrambled. Their cells can't divide anymore, and they're a dead man walking. And that's why this cultural group is getting more and more desperate about trying to convert people through our school system. And it's why we, like one of our big projects with the Collins Institute, is trying to create a different iteration of secondary school, so middle school and high school, that is like truly politically neutral, benchmarked to things like prediction markets, so that we don't have to worry about our kids being deconverted, or not deconverted, but acculturized to this failing dominant culture. And so all of the families of this generation that can wither this, and this is something the conservative movement needs to have a conversation about, is what does it look like when the progressives are gone? Because they're going to be gone soon. They're going to be gone by the time our great grandkids are growing up. Can we enter a world where we don't need to decide that we need to kill everyone who's different from us again? Because like you said, like the progressives are just in charge now. And some conservatives, I talk to them and they're like, yeah, once we have power again, we're going to force everyone into my culture. Like the Catholic Ingralists and stuff like that. Like we're going to create a one world monarchy and everyone's going to have to bow to our culture. And right now they're our cultural allies. But I'd love it if we can, right now, while we're all fighting together, sort of iron out a contract that says once we're rid of the progressives, that we don't start killing each other again.
Yeah, this is kind of that's how people don't believe in like human biodiversity enough when they can even imagine the idea that their own operating system will just win out globally. I mean, this is kind of like the neoliberal idea that it's I think people need to maybe to put it as just be a bit more racist, a bit more sexist about these things so that they can understand that different people need different systems, different ways of approaching the world, and it is fine. And yeah, I think that's something that needs to be accounted for in whatever system might emerge. Yeah, I hope people think about this.
I also think, something where we talk about like updating cultures and stuff like that is this is not the world of our grandparents. And if you look like just in the last 50 years, sperm rates have dropped 51%. Sperm mobility has dropped 51% and sperm rates have dropped 63%, but it's some like insane number. Like we might be headed towards global sterilization in the near future. And so like our use of reproductive technology, I think may look out there right now because obviously traditionally cultures didn't need to engage with reproductive technology. But I do worry about some of the traditional cultures that are so resistant to engage with it. Are they going to be able to survive this crucible of, and who knows what's causing this? It could be, endocrine disruptors, for example. It's one of these things where like, if the progressive movement didn't identify, and I support the LGBTQ community, but I do think that like we do need to be aware that like the rates of the number of LGBTQ people are rising like really, really quickly. And if we know that endocrine disruptors are doing things like causing other parts of our reproductive system to act unusually, could this be connected with this? And so how is human sexuality? I mean, testosterone, has dropped 20% in the last 60 years? Like, or no, it's the last 30 years or something, like really quickly. So I think that even our concepts of gender might actually need an update because of how much we've messed with our environment, or we need to build conservative cultures that can not have access to all these pollutants. But it's really hard to protect yourself. I mean, if you're living any sort of financially realistic life from these pollutants that are changing the way we express ourselves, look, and act.
Yes, I think there's there's a kind of stark reality that that's like I said, there's going to be people who object to the idea of even IVF in total. I mean, I've had Katie
No, and
Faust
I
on.
understand. Well,
Yeah,
I want to go into IVF. So a lot of people object to our use of IVF. They're like, you're killing embryos. Life begins at conception. It's like, well, yeah. And some cultures believe life begins, at the production of sperm. And it's where do you draw the line? For our culture, where we draw the line is our kids. Like for me, I'm like, okay, if one of our kids wouldn't exist, like when you make any decision, like I could pick up a pin. I have 2 pins on the table. I could say, if you pick up this pin, this kid won't exist in the future, right? Well, then I've killed that kid, right? And because we can't have kids without IVF, and because IVF, even if we could, it increases the size of our fertility window, it's sort of a cultural mandate for us. But I can respect that it's not a cultural mandate for other people as long as they don't come from my kids or try to kill my kids. That's where I'm like, no, that's where I draw the line.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the idea that a lot of children are created who wouldn't have the chance, especially for people who, you know, I mean, this is going to sound very eugenicist of me, but people who maybe made other decisions in terms of education, or were maybe running the wrong software for a while. I mean, just the idea that you can expand your fertility window is yeah, it's unprecedented and very useful technology for people who might have missed the boat. And a lot of times those people, yeah, are the kind of people we want to be having children. I mean, I don't know how much more euphemistically I can put this, but yeah, I
Right.
mean,
The IQ shredder
yeah,
argument, right? That
exactly.
it's you're taking a ton of people out of the reproductive pool
Exactly,
by.
and this whole question about IQ. I mean, it also kind of grates me in a way, because it's like, oh, it's not necessarily a perfect measure of things. It's got a quite high predictive value. I mean, there's quite a lot of research on this, but civilizationally, it is extremely important. A lot of the things that we don't even know how it would feel to miss at this point were created on the backs of people with high IQ. Their knowledge can scale infinitely, like the amount of improvement a society that you can have from just one individual who happens to be very smart, inordinately smart, is insane. And I feel like it's not just me trying to pad my social circle, or uh, uh, I don't know, tying myself to certain vanity metrics or things like that. This is civilizationally crucial, and things like the reverse Flynn effect, and like you were saying, one standard deviation down is absolutely catastrophic in so many directions that it's another thing that people just can't fathom. It's not just us trying to have really nice dinner parties. It's much much more than that.
Well, I also think that there's this misunderstanding around this technology. So people hear, oh, they might be looking at IQ of their potential embryos. And so what's going to happen is when this technology is broadly accessible, everyone's going to choose like tall Caucasian children with blue eyes and a high IQ. And it's like, no, they're not. Like, you think a black family is going to choose that? You think like a Middle Eastern family is going to choose that? This is going to allow for a new type of diversity to enter the world, where when we're looking at IQ in these genetic sets right now, that is only because the technology is very nascent. Even just in 5 or 6 years, when people are using this technology, they'll be looking at like 30 different scores of different types of intelligences, from creativity to verbal to math and these things might have some correlation with each other. But what's really cool is different cultures that value different things. And this is what's so cool about diversity, will choose different things for their kids, because they'll have different cultural hypotheses about what constitutes intergenerational improvement. We don't believe that there's like good genes and bad genes. We just believe that from the perspective of individual cultures. And that's what I'm really excited about, is when it's no longer just a discussion of IQ, but it's like, oh, my family opted for measures A through Z, like A through B, and we opted through measures like D through F. Let's see who does better in this post AI world, where like everything changes in terms of the types of intelligence you need to succeed.
But also, I feel like a future in which you have all these different cultures, specializations, different forms of intelligence or high performance. If you get hit by some completely unexpected problem, which we will be hit by as a species for many, many generations, you're going to be more likely to end up with a solution when you have a lot of different mindsets, worldviews, and skill sets approaching it than if just like 3 or 4 are. So we feel like overall, if you have a diversified portfolio in terms of these things, you're way better off as a collective.
Yeah, but that would mean that we somehow break out of the monoculture before we get to the point where this is actually possible. I'm not saying that people would choose the exact same thing, but it does seem to me like, okay, if there is a hierarchy, there is a pretty clear hierarchy of what is important now to most people who would have access to this technology maybe in the next 20, 30, 40 years. And IQ is at the top, I think, at least as far as I can imagine. And then obviously there are certain other aesthetic markers, but yeah, there would seem to be a pretty clear direction that things would take. I mean, obviously, it would depend very much what the actual pool of options would be, because I know there is a technology kind of looming on the horizon which would expand the possibilities for polygenic selection, which ties into the creation of like pluripotent stem cells out of pretty much any other cell. And that would allow people to have many, many more embryos to choose from. Obviously, that has a lot of ethical implications. I mean, that's another thing, but that would essentially widen the menu much, much more broadly, which is not something that you could apply today.
Yeah, she's talking about IVG technology, and we're probably about 10 years away from it being applicable at a broad scale. And I think that's where I would really recommend people who, because I don't know if it makes sense to do IVF just to use this technology. But with IVG technology, you don't need to do IVF anymore. You can use skin cells or something. But it also allows for the creation of new cultures, because you can have things like a gay couple have kids that are biologically 100% theirs, and all sorts of other weird things that aren't really allowed for in our current cultural ecosystem.
Yeah, I could just hear the roar of the religious conservatives in my audience right now. Excuse
Well, and
me.
the mass murder of all of these embryos that aren't theoretically being used, to
Yes,
have like
and
thousands
the gay
created.
couples having non
Yeah,
female reproductive involved children.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
What I love is you could have some people who are like, I think we should only be women. So I am going to like engineer my kids to all be females and only be attracted to females. And we will create a culture that is just like female. But
The
what's interesting
Amazons.
about this is, I mean, that's a cultural hypothesis. And as long as we're able to maintain a pluralistic cultural ecosystem, that hypothesis gets to compete alongside all the other hypotheses. And right now, what we're seeing in the world is the hypotheses that seem to be doing best are the conservative Christian hypotheses mostly, or at least conservative, older religious tradition hypotheses. So it's a pretty high bar to outcompete them. So I think a lot of people who might, instinctually react negative to this, because they don't like the environment that those kids are being raised in. I mean, I think that that's the same instinct that progressives have when they don't like the environment that your kids are being raised in, and that I think, when I look at my political philosophy, it's just don't mess with my kids. Like don't come into my culture and try to survive by converting my kids. And I think that that's the only way we maintain any level of societal harmony, is by not allowing other cultures to come in and take your kids.
Yeah, I think that's a very complex problem, and I think that's one thing that a lot of people kind of on the dissident right are reacting to, just because it's a lot of these are kind of libertarian thought experiments and kind of what could happen in the near future or maybe not so near future. But there's always kind of the question behind all this is power. I mean, how will your cultures maintain this type of sovereignty? I mean, it feels like that's kind of the problem to solve before all problems. I don't have a personal solution. Obviously some people have kind of this network state approach, which also throws open all sorts of questions about the monopoly on the local monopoly on violence. There's obviously the kind of the Moldbugian CEO slash monarch style. Yeah, but I feel like this could throw a wrench into into a lot of the creating your own culture and kind of having that distance, that sovereignty over your own family, because people like you correctly intuited, they don't like it for you to be doing extremely customized stuff with your own children. I'm sure that this is something that's not news to you, because I'm sure you've gotten quite a lot of reactions to this. I don't think the state's gotten involved in your life yet, but it wouldn't be out of the question for regulation to appear, maybe on the basis of some more experimental approaches to this.
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean, so
totally.
what does regulation really mean in this space? What it means is they're basically limiting this to only the ultra rich, only the people who can travel to other countries, and I think that that's deeply perverse, especially when this technology is becoming dramatically cheaper by the year. I mean, I'm talking 50% cheaper like every year, and I don't see that stopping anytime in the near future. So yeah, I totally hear you. And people could come for our family. Like that's always something you have to worry about. And then what do? Well, you move. And if you move, then you can be much more aggressive. If you look at animal models, if we were to use CRISPR, we could maybe get IQ up 8 standard deviations in one generation. And that puts us at the same level as AI and stuff like that. Now, we wouldn't do that because I don't really believe in experimenting with our kids, but I think that some families are going to start doing stuff like that.
Well, I think
yeah.
there's also this element in the book, when it talks about sovereignty and protecting your culture in the face of hostility for thousands of years. There have been cultures that have lived within hostile environments where they are the minority, where they are frequently attacked and killed, but they persevere in some cases much longer than other cultures which prefer to either be isolationist or dominating, as I should say, Malcolm words it in the religion book. So I think that there's also just it's something to keep in mind with your own culture is what kind of strategy do you have? How are you going to protect yourself? Are you going to survive within a hostile environment? In which case, okay, how are you going to make yourself either uninteresting or useful to that environment? So while they may not love you, they kind of need you. Like maybe because you can engage in banking and they can't. Or, how are you going to hide away? And be somewhere where they don't need your resources, where they don't need you to be dead.
Yes, this is the core question for a lot of people, because I interview a lot of people on this show, and I know a lot of people now with my searches that are attempting to build maybe not as thought out or specific of a cultural plan as you two are, but they are kind of trying to build their own institutions. They're trying to, a lot of people trying to live off the grid and kind of
Yeah.
build up from a local level. So this is, a very good question. I think I'm maybe a bit poisoned because I've been watching the Waco documentary this morning, and I was like, yeah, I mean, just imagining the ATF or whatever local equivalent we have breaking down our door for whatever strange misstep. But anyway, yeah, I think I'm just I'm primed. But yeah, it just feels like it's probably one of the more immediate questions that need to be resolved in some way. But yeah, I mean, I guess if you have super intelligent children, they could be, inordinately useful to whatever culture they're in.
Well, and if you understand genetic technology, I think with a lot of this stuff, people can really posture about how anti IVF they are until they can't have kids themselves. Then they come to our little island where we have all of our IVF and human factories set up and stuff like that. And I think that's just the way it is with a lot of this stuff. When you realize that your culture could die, that you can't reproduce, that you can't have kids, a lot of the things that you used to think were like, this is a hard line for me, break. And it makes sense because all of your ancestors who didn't do everything in their power to ensure that they did have kids don't exist. Like you don't have ancestors who didn't do that.
Yes, yeah. I think, that's kind of what I was saying just before we started the show as well, that I was lucky that this wasn't even something I had to ethically contend with. And I do understand kind of the perspectives from both sides, but if I would have had to use IVF, I probably would have, had a torturous month of, considering it. And then, the next month I'd probably be at the clinic, starting the whole thing and doing my best to have children, because that's most important to me. And I think you lay out a very good case for why it might become more important to more people, just because we're, not only kind of culturally and civilizationally at a bottleneck, but just, yeah, it could be in the water as well. So yeah, something's got to give.
It's in the receipts for sure. Have you heard just like that in terms of concentrations of endocrine disruptors, like just the like literal receipts
Really?
that you get? Yeah. So like every day you're coming into contact with stuff that is, like it's really, I think people don't realize the extent to which we are exposed to things that are not looking great. And there's some amazing, fascinating research on this that shows the impact that you actually have on children. So like, I wish that I'd known going into my first pregnancy, where especially our first child was male. And, when you're pregnant as a mother and you're exposed to these things, they're going through to the baby. Also things that you've accumulated in your body go through to the baby. So there are so many things I wish that I'd known that people just don't know about that I could have done. Like there was one study on, and I can share these links with you if it helps.
Please
for show
do,
notes.
I'm just like, now it's crazy.
I know, right?
Literally now pregnant with a male child, and I'm like, what exactly is it that I shouldn't be doing?
I know. There's, oh man, yeah, and there's amazing, fascinating research. So one thing that I wish I'd known before I ever got pregnant. Of course, it's kind of late for you. It's late for me too. I'm sorry, but they did some research on the presence of various forms of endocrine disruptors in firemen in Australia. And they looked at what the effect of donating blood was, blood and plasma. I think maybe it was just blood. And that actually did a really good job at clearing it out of the system. Also, this is your second pregnancy, and sort of your first kid kind of gets a brunt of it. They like clean out a lot of it too. No. So whoops. But the really interesting effect too is Malcolm's talking about, testosterone levels dropping and whatnot. This isn't probably just due to things that are happening after people are born. One of the effects of exposure to endocrine disruptors in pregnancy is literal like less maleness, like, right? Like the default human, like a blank human is female, and like there's stuff that happens during the pregnancy that makes a fetus into a male child. And so one of the big longer term differences that has been found in more longitudinal studies on children who had higher levels of endocrine disruptors in like maternal, blood analyses, especially during the first trimester. There were shorter distances between the anus and the penis. So sort of like less of the maleness happened. Also, there are more female-like play behaviors, I think up to like age 11. Of course, they're still doing this research. So who knows how long it lasts. But a lot of this is stuff that can't be reversed. So to Malcolm's point, there's going to be, this realization when it's already too late of, oh crap, I'm infertile now. Oh no, what am I going to do? And you don't know that you handle your receipt, like you buy a sandwich and then you handle the receipt and then you eat the sandwich and oh crap, like what have I done? So yeah, I think it's really helpful to not demonize technology like this when it's convenient because you don't need it, because it may be very, very necessary in the future. Not that that's a great thing. It can be though.
Yes, I think it's much easier to do, and especially in kind of more conservative religious circles where kind of the people who are the outliers tend to be the spokespeople. The people who just kind of magically had 8 children, and it's easier for them to say. So yeah, I mean it's yeah, it's something I definitely consider myself if I was in that situation. But yeah. Um. Anyway, I think we're slowly coming up on time. I want to ask you the last question, the question of the show that everyone gets at the end of the show, and I do hope you come back on because I feel like we just kind of scratched the surface of a lot of interesting things that you two are working on. And obviously the most high profile thing here is obviously the embryo selection, but you have your fingers in many pies, and you also have the Collins Institute, which I'd love to talk about maybe next time. But yes, do you have a recommended subversive, one together, one each, whichever way you'd like, that you'd like to recommend to the audience? I mean, it could be any sort of character, someone who's been influential in your thinking and you think is maybe underrated.
Malcolm Collins. I mean, I am his number one stan. Sorry, people, but his what's really interesting about Malcolm's work is that it is interdisciplinary in a way that I think creates new connections that can help you look at problems that matter to you in a totally new light. And I'm very biased, obviously, but I didn't want to marry someone. Remember, people, like, this is someone he's worth listening to. So the Pragmatist Guides, I highly recommend. I know that's it's a little shilly, but
no, I think it's absolutely lovely, and I obviously not with the same intensity, but I do agree. I mean, I've been browsing some of the books. You've been very kind to send me all the Pragmatist guides. My husband was like, "Did you order a lot of stuff off of Amazon? Like, what's with these exotic packages?" I was like, "No, this is from my career as a podcaster. I get these." So it's really lovely, and yeah, that's what I'd probably the attribute I'd attach to it is interdisciplinary and comprehensive, and there's a beginning and an end, and it's all very well thought out and structured, and insights jump off of every page. So yeah, I think this is a very fair recommendation.
I can. So I'll share one more though, if I can't
Of
choose
course.
Malcolm. And both Malcolm and I are huge fans of her, which is Ayla. I mean, a lot of people know her on Twitter for her research on sexuality. We just think it's the way that she approaches morality, and her research is incredibly intelligent, incredibly interesting. She's a very polarizing figure, obviously. But I think the more people, we know a lot of people who have a sort of moral response to her immediately and just choose to discount her, and then read a little bit of her work and then spend like the next 2 weeks reading everything she's ever written, because they discover that the way that she thinks is very different. It comes from a very first principles standpoint, to a great extent because she had a very conservative religious upbringing. And I think that, again, that's something that really appeals to me, is an interdisciplinary and first principles approach to key problems, because we live in an era of echo chambers, of everyone just kind of rehashing and reprinting what they're seeing elsewhere. And it's very, very hard to find people who look at things through an untainted lens. And Ayla is one of those very, very rare people who does that.
But to clarify, I mean, her system is very orthogonal to ours, but it is very clearly self-developed instead of just taking it from the larger society, which is what we respect there. Another one we'd recommend that we actually do a lot of citations of in the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, so you won't need to read the original source. We cite all the good stuff, is Winwood Reade. He is one of the most undersold intellectual figures, I think, in world history. And we just don't know about him because he died so young. But during his time, he was, even Sherlock Holmes said he was the best writer in human history, like canonically in the thing. Cecil Rhodes really liked him. A lot of other people were like, Cecil Rhodes said he's the man who made me who I am today. So a lot of thinkers at the time, I think George Orwell also was a big stan of his. And what I like about him is so many of his ideas were really influential to us in crafting our own family sort of belief system. And we really see him as a philosophical ancestor to our family's belief system, and a philosopher who's often undersold. But yeah, really, you should just be reading Simone's books, not mine.
Shut up, Malcolm. Lies. Everyone knows. Listen, women aren't funny. I'm not that smart. Malcolm is a genius here, but he's also the ultimate gentleman. So yeah, anyway, this was so much fun though. We'd love to come back at some point. If you're ever in the area, oh my gosh, come stay at our place. Yeah, we love this podcast. We love what you do. And it's so much fun talking.
Thank you so much. This is lovely to hear, and I really do like and appreciate the dynamic between you two. You're obviously, you found each other through the most systematic and meticulous way, but also it worked out. It's a testament to your system, to whatever you're doing. The compatibility between you two, and just the level of respect and admiration and cooperation, and just the magnitude of your common project, both in terms of children and educating them and educating the world. I mean, whatever people might chafe at specific opinions of yours, but I think the proof is in the pudding, and I do respect people who just live their beliefs in a clear way like you do. So I'm very grateful for what you do, and thankful for you coming on.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Well, is there other, I mean, you run the Collins Institute, pro-natalism.org, the Pragmatist guide series, which you can all find on Amazon. Is there any other thing that you're working on currently that you'd like people to know about?
No, those are the top ones. Just civilization. Trying to save it. It's really kind of important. So
it's exhausting.
Check it out. And it's really hard. No one understands. So please check it out. Pro-natalist.org.
Yeah, well, yes, please do. I'll put all the links in the show notes. And yeah, thank you again for coming on.
Thanks.